All right, folks, it's time for World Politics, which we always do on Tuesday and Thursdays. And we know a lot of interesting things are happening in the world. Of course, a lot of people are paying attention and getting ready for the debates. And of course, there are a number of issues out there, including things that are centered around predatory lending and other things just around the government and even the reach of federal agencies and all along those lines. So I've got some fascinating guests that are going to share a little bit about that. And ironically, I don't know if they know this, but I'll share it with them right now. My mother, till she retired, was very much involved in that field as she was the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation and all along those lines. So she definitely knows a lot about community development and community development of resources and all along those lines. She was also a member of the board for the Rural Center here in North Carolina and all along those kind of spaces. So definitely something that I've been engaged in, learned a lot about. And I think I told either Cliff or Michael earlier that I had a good friend that actually did a whole Nostra Barrio or a soap opera around, I think the soap opera was called Nostra Barrio, but it was around the whole notion of predatory lending. And that was done by my good friend Dilcy Davis, and it actually got some play and all along those lines. So I want to bring in Michael. He might introduce us to Cliff as well, and we're going to learn about some of the things that they've got going on because, like I said, they definitely, when I talked to them and reached out to them, we were talking about just the notion of the overreach of federal agencies, but also around predatory lending and how it is still an issue that is going on even in this day and time when we're in the year of 2024. But I'll bring in Michael, and like I said, I'll bring in Cliff as well, and we might have some other guests joining us. But Michael, glad that you were able to join us. And like I said, my mother was the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation, but she was also involved there in the Rural Center for a number of years and served on their board. And Andrea Harris, who is with the Institute of Minority Economic Development, was a good family friend until she passed away and all along those lines. But I just want to hear more about your thoughts around what's going on just in terms of the way that we're dealing with a lot of these issues. Because when I was talking to you online and just in our emails, I was going like, this is a conversation that I think a lot of people need to pay more attention to. And ironically, one of the founders, because I know y'all just recently met one of the founders, that being Kim Calhoun, but the other one is actually dealing with agencies and how they deal with people because he's dealing with an issue, I believe, involving his pension fund, and then because he is a pension attorney and all in that space. I think it has to do with farmers, if I remember correctly, but you'll have to tell us if he comes on the show or on a later show as well. But if you'll just share a little bit about what y'all got going on and what is going on in your space in these very important issues.
Yeah. Well, Mark, once again, thank you for having me on the show. And I guess the overall issue of predatory lending is something that's near and dear to my heart. I mean, I'm from rural Arkansas. I tell people I'm from the Arkansas Delta where the soil is rich, but the people are poor. And my hometown was once rated the worst place to live in America 2 years in a row. So we went back to back. My mother has a PhD in housing from Florida State University, and she was the dean of agriculture and at UAPB, the University of Arkansas in Pine Bluff. And so I kind of grew up in a household, and her program started was a center of excellence in regulatory sciences. So my household, our dinner conference, our kitchen table conversation, our dinner table conversation was kind of around those types of issues in housing, community development. And I wound up landing my dream job when I had the opportunity to go to Washington during the Clinton administration and work for the Federal Empowerment Zones program. So that's kind of where I started my career in community development work and community development finance as a Fed. And then I've done various types of consulting, and I've worked in faith-based community, and I kind of got a network of CDCs and other type of NGOs all across the country. Now, I kind of happened to meet Cliff Rosenthal. He's an organizer in his own right, and he is kind of like the man. He's the Obi-Wan guru in the kind of community development credit union movement and pioneering the community development financial institution space. And I bring all of that is relevant to the question about predatory lending, because these are the type of institutions that are anti-predatory, they're non-predatory. And so those types of institutions are the good guys, and they are the antidote to some of the predatory practices in the space.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad we got Cliff here, and definitely we'll bring in some of the other folks as well and everything. And there are a couple of cases that y'all have dealt with also. But I would love to hear from both of you about the book, because I understand it's called Community Capital, Race, Equity, and the Credit Union Movement. And even on some of these shows, we've talked about how race does sometimes play a part in banking and all along those lines. Some people agree, some people disagree. But I was just wondering y'all's take as ones that have done this research as to how much race is dealing with the way that things are being funded.
Well, the Community Reinvestment Act was passed back in 1977 as an effort to eliminate all the most obvious forms of redlining, banks denying, loans, and even financial products to people of the wrong color, of the wrong economic status, and so forth. And some of the worst abuses of redlining and predatory lending are no longer as obvious as they were. But in its more insidious forms today, you even see people of color basically being denied banking services, or basically sent to the other door of the bank, and so forth. So I think the inequities have become more insidious, and sometimes the biases that we've seen are really implicit in what seems to be sort of the fair and honest regulations. And this is really, to a large degree, what I wrote about in my portion of the book, that it's not as if I was battling these guys who proclaim themselves as evil. These are decent institutions. They were regulators. They were actually people in the cooperative movement, in the development movement. But the way they constructed policies and regulations and so forth had the effect of disadvantaging people without money or of the wrong color. So I think we see the persistence of this today. Predatory lending per se has not been eliminated. Even after I left my life's work working with credit unions, I went to work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington for a couple of years, which is really the sworn enemy of predatory lending. And unfortunately, some of the banking industries really oppose those efforts to give people a fair shake.
Well, just along those same lines, before I bring in some of the other people as well, I did see that Mr. McCray, you have definitely blown the whistle on some public corruption, including with the USDA and Acorn. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that before we get back into some more conversation around the whole notion of credit unions and what they are doing or aren't doing in that space. But when I saw those big organizations that you were taking on, and big government organizations, I was like, I've really got to ask him about that as well. So, Mr. McCray, if you want to try to take that on.
Sure. Mark, let me back up just for 1 second, because I do want to add something on that predatory lending piece. Right. And where I live in Arkansas, we've actually, would it be statutorily, we've done away with the payday lenders, the check cashing places. So we've done away with predatory lending, but we haven't done away with predatory products. So what's happened now is some of the same types of loans are now gone in the house in some of the larger banks, and we still have these excessive fees on overdraft payments, withdrawals, and it's still very pernicious, and so you still have to be careful. So it's one of those cases where even when you think you've won, you have to be ever vigilant, because it will just be repackaged and practiced, because these are very profitable. But going back to the point I was making about when you asked me about being a whistleblower. Well, when I told you I landed my dream job when my governor went to Washington, and I got to work for the White House. But one of the things that happened is I was working on a program that was the largest community development package since LBJ's Great Society program at the time, and that was the Federal Empowerment Zones program. And I discovered once that there was essentially a $40 million misappropriation, and for me, it was essentially people were stealing from poor people. And so, had I been born in DC and lived in the Beltway all my life, I might have viewed that as politics as usual. But where I grew up, $40 million is a lot of money. We're not talking about, $4,000, even $40,000, but, $40 million, somebody has to say something. And so I felt like I was basically defending and rebuilding helping communities like the one that I grew up in. And so that's how I became a federal whistleblower. It essentially changed the trajectory of my life and my career. I've kind of made that public interest advocacy kind of my work. It's my mission, my passion. And so I'm one of the guys that speaks truth to power, and I help others who are so bold. Regarding Acorn, actually, I met Acorn, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, is probably one of the most powerful social justice organizations in the country. It is now, I guess, some people will say it's gone. Some people will say it's reformed. And we can have a whole interesting conversation about that. As a matter of fact, my first book, Race, Power, and Politics, Memoirs of Acorn Whistleblower, talked about how I got involved in Acorn and what draws people to that type of organizing work. And so I started to kind of peel the onion on the good things about Acorn and then also the bad. And essentially kind of what happened with Acorn was you had what was once a truly venerable organization that essentially kind of became a little corrupted from the inside. And so I was one of the few people that well, actually, I wasn't the whistleblower. I was a support person. I was the advocate for the whistleblowers. And I became that because of the work that I do in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. I host the largest whistleblower conference in the country. It's called the Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival. And it's actually where we're going to have the official release of Community Capital next month in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill.
Well, just really along those same lines, and before I bring in my co-panelists and everything, for both of you, what role do you think that credit unions play in the minority communities, and what does it take to bring financial justice to communities of color? Because I know that that's something that a lot of people have been thinking about, and they're definitely dealing with that on a lot of different ways. There have been other shows, even here on the network, that we've talked about this and this kind of conversation around it. So what is your thoughts around that? And then I definitely want to hear from both of you, because this is one of the things that I know everybody on the network is very much interested in, which is the consequences of regulatory agency overreach and everything in that space. But if you want to share the notion around the role of race, particularly, and within the whole credit union conversation.
Okay. Well, credit unions were born basically in the fight against predatory lending in the early 20th century. Literally, they were established because working people were basically at the mercy of usurers who would come to the factory gates every Friday and basically take exorbitant amounts of money and so forth. So credit unions were very much born with the notion that if people got together and pooled their savings and loaned to each other, they'd be able to make loans to folks who wouldn't get it otherwise, and they'd be able to do it at reasonable rates, which are generally far less than you would get from a commercial institution, a bank, or even certainly from a predatory lender. So really, credit unions are the vehicle that has emerged as probably the leading source of affordable credit for low-income communities, for people who are struggling to survive, and so forth. Even so, the fact is they're unknown to half of the population. There are 150 million people who belong to credit unions. That leaves about 200 million people who probably don't know what a credit union is and probably could benefit from it. And it's certainly true in Black and other communities of color. The problem has been that many of those institutions that were established through churches and through community organizations have suffered from the consolidation in the banking system, and there are many fewer of them than there used to be.
Yeah, just really quickly, the other question before I bring in Kim, because like I said, even in the email to you, I do know that there are some people, including Kim, who's one of the founders, that have dealt with this whole notion of the overreach of regulatory agencies. Like I said, I think that, and I won't speak for the man since he's not here, but probably Nick would say that there's some overreach going on with the pension community, because he's actually doing a deposition, I think, today because of that, and he's stated that publicly. So I'm not speaking out of school and everything, but what is your thoughts around the overreach of some of these regulatory agencies?
Well, Mark, let me jump in here because the portion of the book, Community Capital, that's really what I talk about. What I do is I recount the experience of the first virtual credit union that was authorized by the NCUA, and that was my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi Federal Credit Union. We started that, and it's the story of how a innovative, small but mighty credit union was built and then ultimately destroyed by governmental overreach. And so we start to talk about some of the biases. We were not your typical, or we were not your grandmother's credit union, because typically speaking, you get a lot of credit unions that are formed, from the black church, and maybe you have some of the church mothers that are working on it. They may not have, not that they're not good people, but they may not necessarily have a level of certain financial sophistication. With the Kappa Alpha Psi Federal Credit Union, we literally were started by some investment bankers, college-educated people that had backgrounds in finance. So we weren't the kind of the typical people. And then again, if you recall, I spoke about how my mother had started the regulatory sciences program at UAPB. I have a regulatory background, and so I was the one that had to go through the rules and the regs and advise my fraternity brothers as to what the rules say, what we can do and what we can't. And ultimately, I discovered that we were literally being over-regulated out of existence. And so that was one of the things that I brought to the table. While Cliff doesn't remember us meeting before, the first time we have met once before, and that was when we attended. It was one of the credit union conference. I forget which one. It may have been CUNA or perhaps the Federation. But we met there, and Cliff was really amazed at what we were doing at Kappa, because he said usually most small credit unions wind up joining the Federation in order to get secondary capital, to get their low income designation, all these other things that Kappa had already done. And we did it by reading the regs. And so it was just most unfortunate that for whatever reason, we wound up on the wrong side of our examiners and regulators, and we literally were regulated out of existence. And so that's what my portion of community capital is about. I go further. What we did was we took the extraordinary effort of actually challenging our liquidation in federal court. And so in this book, I bring the receipts. I bring closed door transcripts from the NCUA board meetings. I bring hearing transcripts. I bring all the correspondence back and forth as to how we were, our pushback and our fight to save our credit union. And so it becomes really a cautionary tale of regulatory overreach.
It's one of those things that just really quick that I wanted to get to, because I want to bring up Kim and Shaquille, but I know that Kim has even sometimes talked about our current DA who is actually running for the governor and all along those lines. And she has sometimes felt and stated, so I'm not speaking out of school, that he has done some overreach himself as well. So I was wondering your thoughts around that and even what they're saying, because it sounds parallel to what you were saying happened to you and everything, Kim, but maybe you can talk to them and even share your experiences, because it sounds like there's some parallels there, but go for it.
I would love to get to the bottom of what his overreach was about and the harassment that they put me through. I hope he doesn't make governor, but our second choice, I don't know. But anyway, I want to thank you too for the work that you're doing. I am part of an advocate group as well. And one of the problems that we have been seeing progressively going is predatory lending practices towards elderly. Yeah. And it's really starting to get on my nerves. We've handled about 5 cases in the 2 weeks. Fortunately, 100% successfully got some of them reversed. I love working with the person that I'm working with because she is just on it. So we just don't sit there and just watch it happen. We get in, we fight it, we just attack it aggressively. But after seeing the amount that I have seen in the past few weeks, I'm seeing that we need to go to DC and we need to start changing the laws. The other thing I want to mention is not just the overreach, it's the underreach. It's what they are not doing to protect the people. It is what they are not doing to help the people that we need to change. And this underreach is happening to a lot of the youth. Okay, they are not helping the youth to be able to afford to get lending. And so, of course, when you get somebody in these kind of situations, they are going to be taken advantage of because they're a little bit desperate. The problem with the elderly abuse that I'm seeing, it's because their minds are not thinking as clear as they used to. They're desperate to get into a different situation, get out of the, one situation they're in and into something else. And these people bait and switch the contracts because they're not going to sit there and read them. And the contracts all say anything said during this meeting has nothing to do with what's written in this contract. And so what we need to do is get people better informed, but we also need to start getting some of these sessions recorded, not the closing session, but the full session. In other words, if the full session isn't recorded, then the closing session cannot be recorded. So there are a lot of things we need to start doing, but predatory lending needs to come to a halt. And you know what? Student loans are the biggest predatory lending I have ever seen in my life. And that is taking a huge advantage of our youth. And it needs to come to a halt.
Just really quickly, I don't know if the
Hi,
gentleman had any response, or Shaq had some thoughts, because I know he deals with a lot in the business community as well. I know Sasha is going to know more about the political framework of the whole conversation as well, because I do think it is something that is dealing with politics and even to some degree world politics as well. But I was just wondering y'all's take, because one of the things I didn't mention is that both of you kind of alluded to it, both of you have political backgrounds, because I know, Michael, you mentioned being part of the Clinton administration. If I remember correctly, Mr. Rosenthal, you were part of the Obama administration, if I remember correctly, if I'm not speaking out of school.
Yeah, I was not a political appointee, but indeed I went to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That was created with the help of Elizabeth Warren as well. And Obama was certainly the president at that time, and the agency was quite aggressive. And now it's under constant attack, frankly, from predatory lenders, among others, who want to beat back the regulations.
Shaquille, any thoughts based on what they were saying?
Well, I've got quite a few, actually. So I just want to start off. Thank you for color coordinating with me today, Kim. You look fantastic.
So do you, Jack.
Oh, thank you. I like red. So I do want to address a couple of things. Look, I
got my Trump cup.
Given that I'm not American,
in America.
Given that I'm not American, I can't really comment much on some of the issues you brought up with redlining and stuff like that, because I don't really have the historical context. I haven't grown up there. But there's a couple of things I want to say. But Mark, this is actually the first time I've come on to World Politics, as you know, Kim, which was originally a show that was set up for me. And it's the first time I've appeared because Mark said, we're having a conversation about predatory lending again. And I said, I've got to be there. So I've actually come specifically for that. So a little bit of background on me. So I have been involved in fund management, collective investment schemes, hedge funds, whatever term you want to use. And most of the people I hang out with will say we need less regulations, and we all sort of sit politically on the right. And we look at the United States, we're like, what's the problem? Like, why are people poor? Why are the African-American community complaining? Please let me finish, because I know it doesn't sound like you're going to agree with me, but just wait a moment. What are they complaining about? Just go get another job. Just, stay in school. What's the problem with America? And I always looked at the United States as being, it must be the greatest. You guys always tell us you're the greatest country on earth. So I was like, okay, cool. Like, America's the greatest country on earth. It's the most freedom. There's the most opportunity. And then I did something that was terrible. I came to America. The very first time I came to America, I was like, oh, actually, this no regulation thing, I'm not sure I can support this. I have a few issues here. So I remember going through North Carolina and going through Georgia, and I was in rural Georgia. And I saw a sign saying checks cashed. And the first comment I made was, why can't they spell checks properly? It's supposed to have a Q in it. The second thing that I said was, like, what's check cashing? What is that? Because we don't really use checks in Australia, or not very, very much. What does check cashing mean? Like, what, you write a check and you just go in and hand them the check and they give you money? Like, is that what it means? And it was explained to me how, like, people get their paycheck and they don't have bank accounts. And so they have to go to these places and they take 4% or 10% or whatever it is. And I'm like, huh? Like, how can you allow that? Like, surely people should be able to get bank accounts. What are we talking about? And then I started to hear more about predatory lending. So I looked into it, and there's a show called, I think it's called American Greed. That there was an episode on that where one of these predatory lending guys got caught because he was using Indian reservations to cover what he was doing and all this sort of stuff. I think it's terrible. And at the top end of the market, I would say that the private equity guys, if they thought they could make $10 million by taking the baby formula out of the mouth of every single baby in America, they wouldn't even hesitate. They'd do it just like that. How do you sleep at night? And for those predatory lenders, especially if you're a conservative, which I'm often labeled as being on the center right, if you believe in God and you're a Christian, I can't remember off the top of my head what the verse is, but there's a couple of verses in the Bible that talks about becoming rich by exploiting the poor. Maybe you should remember that, especially if you're in Arkansas, which is a fairly religious place. You don't take advantage of people, and that's the problem with predatory lending. Why it's been allowed to happen a big part of the time is because of the issues that you guys brought up, that banking services aren't around, that credit unions and mutual funds or mutual societies, savings and loans, those types of groups are subject to regulations which are actually advocated for by the biggest banks that I work with every day. Why do they advocate for those regulations? Because they want to make it harder for smaller groups to be able to compete with them. And it's a terrible situation. The way that holds people back is an absolute disgrace. I don't think it should be a left-wing, right-wing thing. The people on the right are supposed to also care about fairness of contracts, et cetera, et cetera. They say that government, I say this all the time, that government's supposed to be a referee. When people are being unfairly taken advantage of, you can't just let that slide. And if you're on the left, okay, you have to understand that business needs to operate, but stand up for the little guy. And when the little guy says, you know what, I'm going to get 500 people together, I'm going to get 5,000 people together, and we're going to start a financial institution because we're not happy with what we're being provided with, let them do it. If you don't think they comply with the regulations, help them to comply. Don't shut them down. So honestly, I think the predatory lending is such a disgrace. And at a smaller scale, pawn shops that say, hey, bring your necklace in and it's worth $300, but we'll lend you $50, but you've got to pay us $20 a month in interest, a secured loan, and they use as an excuse, well, we've got costs of staff, and then the person can't afford it, or if they're on a direct debit or something, which is even worse if it's a payday loan, and they're on a direct debit, what you're doing is you're taking advantage of somebody who's poor, and maybe they've got to skip a meal. And if you're going to add to your asset pool, money which you've earned by making it worse for people at the bottom, I don't know how you live with yourself, and I think it's totally wrong. So again, it's one of the very, very rare times that I will say we need more regulations on this. We need to have a fairer system, maybe less regulations on smaller groups that are trying to start up that are community oriented, but we certainly need to make sure that there are regulations that prevent the poorest people or older people, Kimberly, as you've been talking about, from being taken advantage of, because it's easy to do. Anybody can do it. And we need to make sure that those people don't do it. And don't wrap yourself up in, it's the free market. Bullshit. It is not.
Can I build on that?
Yeah. You want to build on that, Cliff?
Yeah, if I could, and I want to put it in a global context, and I think it relates to this over-regulation business, that the rules of the road for the capitalist system are formed in places like Basel, Switzerland, where they basically established regulations on things such as capital adequacy and so forth. The rules that they establish in the effort to prevent the abuses of the largest financial institutions are basically carried down and trickled down to the smallest institutions, and that is why largely it has been hard for these smallest institutions, including Kappa Alpha Psi, to survive. That capital standards that were put in place to safeguard the very biggest institutions are applying in a way to the smallest institutions in a way that's killing them. And I think that was part of the problem that accounted for the demise of Kappa Alpha Psi Federal Credit Union. Maybe Michael can take it from there.
Right. Well,
Sorry, Michael.
Well, no, I was going to say that was part of the reason. But what happened with Kappa is that for small credit unions and young credit unions, there's actually a different set of regs. What we were experiencing that you're not held to as onerous a standard as, say, Bank of America. What happened with us was that we were saying that we just apply the regs that apply to us, and our examiners refused to do it. They would come up with, I guess, this excuse of what's the word, Cliff? Safety and soundness. Safety and soundness to say that they had to regulate us as if we were, you know, $100 million, you know, bank, and we were a small credit union.
Point. Yes.
Yeah, so it was different rules. I mean, the rules were supposed to be different. They were supposed to at least allow us to get started, and the rules were intentionally changed really to put us out of business. So, and then Mark, I think one of the other things you asked about, I think we're talking about, well, some of the capital. We literally had a situation where there was a contract that we had disputed with a vendor, with a data provider. It was beyond the statute of limitations to collect the debt. We released $30,000 in equity from it. We had a reserve account. Once the statute of limitations had expired, we released that into general equity for the credit union. Our net worth ratio shot up. The examiners literally went into our digital cash register, took $30,000 from us, paid a debt that was, even if you argue that it was due, it was beyond the statute of limitations. So there was no remedy, or worst case scenario, we could have negotiated it, essentially liquidating our capital and using that as an excuse to liquidate the credit union. So to me, that's theft. Okay, little theft by the examiner, but that's some of the stuff that we face as a small credit union.
This is precisely the issue that I bring up when I talk about big businesses versus small businesses. It's that regulatory environment. It's also with small credit unions. I'm looking at taking over a financial services company in Switzerland, so let's leave Basil out of it for a moment. You know, and there's a few $1 billion there in assets. Now, I know probably 10 companies that collectively control around 50 billion euros. None of them would ever do business with a credit union for a number of reasons. One, because the credit unions don't have the ability to provide them with the services, even if they wanted to, which most of them would love to. And two, because if we did, our risk managers would say, oh, that organisation is too small. But then we're forced to go to the biggest banks in the world, and I'm not trying to bag them, but, you know, facts are facts, I think. We're forced to go to the biggest banks in the world who don't have the capital adequacy requirements that everyone else is supposed to have, but we've got to trust them because they're allegedly too big to fail. How is that fair? And oftentimes what you'll see is that larger institutions will make just a coincidental donation to, you know, particular political parties, and all of a sudden they happen to get some sort of exemption from a regulation they advocated the regulation should exist. It distorts it so much. It distorts the market so much. And at the end of the day, it's not the people at the top that have to wear this. It's the people at the bottom. And I think that it is ethically and morally so wrong. It shouldn't happen. If I could make one suggestion, which you guys might not like, given that you're in the credit union sort of space, but a lot of countries in Europe have their post offices act as banks. So Ireland, for example, you can go into the Irish post office, show them your ID, open up a bank account. It's significantly easier than opening up an account with any of the big guys. And you can go to the post office and deposit money or withdraw money or whatever. I wouldn't mind seeing something like that happen in the United States. You know, there's post offices everywhere, and if somebody wants to cash in a check, they can go to their post office and deposit it without having to pay those fees. Something like that would be good. If private enterprise is not going to do the right thing, then maybe government should compete. It's one of the very rare times you'll hear me say that, but maybe that is the case.
Can I mention a couple of shows that are pertinent? Yeah. One is out of Britain called Mr. Somebody versus the Post Office. Oh, yeah. And that is about a bunch of people running post offices that also kind of did financial transactions, and faulty software screwed over thousands of these small banker post office people. And the British government for more than a decade refused to acknowledge these errors that sent people to prison for financial malfeasance when it was all crappy software. Also, I'm coming late to this, but there's a movie from 2020 called The Banker, which is about small African-American bankers trying to be the first bankers in America and what they faced.
Yeah, just really quickly.
Somebody explain this to me. I know you guys can't, because I think we're all on the same side here. But somebody explain this to me. if we all together right now say we're going to set up a credit union in the United States, we're going to go to Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm picking Little Rock because it's the only place I know in Arkansas. So we're going to go to Little Rock, Arkansas. We're going to set up a credit union over there. Okay, one of the things I have to do because of the government requirements is I have to go and buy some government bonds to put onto my balance sheet. Okay, the government bonds have gone down because I bought them during COVID. What happens? I get marked to market, whatever the current market value is, because I'm a small credit union. But right now, the Fed has overpriced to the tune of $800 billion last time I checked, the amount of the face value of the bonds, because what they've allowed the biggest banks in the United States to do is to use those bonds as collateral at their full face value, not at their current market price. But if you're a credit union, you can't do that. Where's the fairness in that?
No, most startup credit unions don't have investments in bonds.
I think my point still remains about fairness being treated fairly.
Yeah. The small ones don't. The large ones do. Absolutely right. And the fact of marking it to market was responsible for the failure of some very large credit unions that were in fact invested in those bonds over 2009. And basically it came within a hair of destroying the credit union system.
Right, but right now today, the biggest banks in America are able to use those bonds at full face value, but the credit unions aren't. The credit unions that are holding them can't. Hedge funds that hold those bonds can't use them at their full face value, but your big banks in America, they can because they're too big to fail. How does that work? If it's okay for them, it should be okay for everybody else, right?
Cliff, any thoughts on that?
I don't know, but you know what, Michael, I'm listening to you about how you guys started your own, and I've for the last few years have dove into looking into what does it take to start your own bank. I know someone who did, has done it very successfully up in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to hopefully get a chance to sit down and talk with him about what made it such a great success, because it was he a privately started bank. What were the biggest problems that you saw when you got yours going, and what do you think you would do different today?
Well, the biggest thing is, the difference between the capital requirements for banks and credit unions. When we started this, we wanted to start Capital Bank. And while we couldn't necessarily raise the equity that was necessary, we went back, regrouped, and decided to come back with the credit union. So back then, I think and Cliff, tell me if I stray off, but they've now instituted some greater capital requirements for credit unions. But before, 15 years ago, you could essentially, you could essentially start one if you had essentially a small business plan that you know where your members are going to come from, and you could organize, and that's why you had up to 10 years to reach 7% capital ratio. And so that's
what was the equity that you needed to raise, Michael, you said you didn't make it to the equity you needed. What was it you needed?
Well, in terms of raw numbers, or again, it was a 7% capital.
So you're talking about starting a bank, and you didn't quite get the equity, you didn't quite get the investors.
I think at that point in time, the requirement there was $2 million.
So did you say two?
Two. Mm-hmm.
I'm in. Let's talk after the show.
Well, absolutely.
No, I'm serious. Let's talk after the show.
No, I mean, because, some of what I looked into in starting a bank, it didn't seem to require a lot as much as it did. You needed to be insured and things like that. I read a story about a woman who started her own. So, it's been a curiosity of mine. So, let's see what you can do to maybe get something started again. And maybe we can help work with some people who are being overlooked in our country right now that might need a little leg up, and they're not getting it from the banks. Because as we all know, you don't go to the bank when you need money. So,
yeah. Can you hang around quickly after the show? Like I'm being deadly serious. I would like to have this conversation in a little bit more detail off air. I didn't realize it was as low as that. I knew it was easy, but it was that easy.
Yeah,
so I'd love to have
quickly and everything, because I did have a quick question for Cliff and actually Sasha may like this part of the conversation, for both Cliff and Michael and everything, because one of the things that I know is being proposed, and there are some people even on this network that might agree with it and everything, including some people that are affiliated with Project 2025, is this notion, and both of you said that you came one as a non-appointee, the other as an appointee. Just out of curiosity, in your own opinions, do we have too many government workers and everything? Because that's one of the things I know that Trump has been proposing, because he's talking about downscaling some of the jobs and even reclassifying some of the jobs and everything. So I was just wondering, in y'all's opinion, because I did hear what Sasha said about it being world politics, and definitely needs to have some global context as well. But is the U.S. government overly, does it have too many workers in y'all's opinion? And I don't know the answer, because like I said, first time meeting y'all gentlemen, so I don't know what your answer is going to be. But do we have too many government workers?
Hard for me to say what the right amount would be, to tell you the truth. There are a lot, I'll tell you that. Is it too many? I don't know. Depends on what sphere you're looking at. In some areas, I think, as such as in environmental protection, they're not nearly enough. Other areas, there may be too many.
I think there's too many doing the wrong kind of work. People often talk to me when I come to America, and I've been to 26 of your states. Haven't been to Arkansas yet, but I'm supposed to be. I'm friends with one of the gubernatorial candidates in your last election. When I come to the States, people often talk to me, if they're on the left, they go, well, why can't we have something more like Sweden? And they're fascinated when I say to them, do you think Sweden is pro-business or anti-business? And they sort of sheepishly go, well, I suppose business is probably kind of hard. No, it's not. Actually, Sweden is a great place to set up a business for a number of reasons. But one of the core reasons why I like Sweden, and the other Scandinavian countries for that matter, is that they will actually come to you and say, we've been looking at what you're doing and you're not actually complying with these couple of regulations. So let's help you to comply. What do you need? What's the issue? And if you actually say to them, look, I can't comply with that because of this, this, and this, if they agree with you, they will then go to the ministers and say, hey, actually, this regulation is having an unintended effect. Now, I'm not trying to say that Sweden's perfect, but there's a massive difference in how they promote business versus what happens in the United States. In the United States, and Australia for that matter, but more so in the US, it becomes a sport for the prosecutors. They look at it and they look through the books and go, oh, I found something that you did wrong. Now what I'm going to do is I'll be really creative in how I prosecute this, and I'm going to put you out of business. That's not what you should be doing, in my opinion. I think government people it shouldn't be an adversarial relationship, which it often is. It actually should be look, we've got these regulations. You may not have intended to breach them. Let's fix that. That's what I would like to see, and I think that's what most of the complaint is about. I think that if government operated that way in the United States, you wouldn't see people who are on the right saying, we need smaller government. I think you'd see people going, actually, this works really well.
Shaquille, the way the credit union industry used to be up till 1971. It changed when the federal government insured deposits. But up till 1971, the credit union industry was very much the way you described, where the regulator's role was very much to help credit unions get started and sustain them. Insurance changed everything. Deposit insurance changed everything. When you put the full faith and credit of the U.S. government behind it, you change the stakeholders enormously.
We probably
Unfortunately,
do.
I was born in December of 1983, so I can't quite relate to what happened prior to the 70s. But your point is well taken, my friend.
We probably do have too many government workers. As more and more AI comes online, AI should be able to cut people's work weeks in half by taking over menial tasks. But Trump is not the guy to decide who is superfluous. He's just going to kick people out who he doesn't agree with politically.
Correct.
I agree with that, Rick.
Come on, guys. Don't consent to Donald Trump and Biden. Let's not do that. We're having such a great conversation about regulation.
Bring up something that I noticed recently when we're talking about the employment state of the country is I've noticed recently a big promotional campaign going around for blue collar workers. Which we all know that Trump campaigns to the blue collar community big time. But there are trucks going out. They're really promoting the blue collar employment factor, get out there, get educated as a plumber, electrician. We need more feet on the street of this kind of employment. The problem is too many people during COVID became more introverted, doing more things on the computer, working more with AI, and not doing the hands-on anymore. So I thought this campaign was interesting. Have any of y'all noticed any of it?
Any ideas, Michael? Or
well, because what's interesting about the blue collar employees and world is they also rely, a lot of them will rely on credit unions, right? It's just not the state employee credit unions, but I'm sure that there are blue collar communities that would rely on either union or credit unions themselves to assist them and get things going. But insurance ruins everything. It's not just the banking world. They get involved. The minute insurance gets involved, everything goes downhill. I mean, look what happened.
I'm sorry, it's not my fault. I promise I'm one of the good bankers and insurers. I promise you I am. I do care. Look, I think the blue collar workers have been left behind. I really do. And look, I didn't follow the traditional path into banking. I always wanted to be a banker, and so I tried to take the shortcuts to get there. Took me 10 times as long to get there, but I found the shortcuts in the end. But I've done it the hard way, and I certainly don't come from a family of money. And I feel like Donald Trump and other centre-right political parties like Nigel Farage at the moment in the UK are appealing to a group of people that feel that they've been left behind. And I think that centre-left parties have got to do a little bit more and empathise a little bit more, because they're coming across as being elitist. But without going into the politics of your country at the moment, which is very divisive, I will still stand by whoever the leader of the executive branch is. It still comes down to that the little guy gets hurt. And I think the little guy doesn't care. They don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a Labor Party or a Tory. They don't care. What they care about is, I'm struggling to put food on the table. And at the moment, we've got protests in Africa at the moment. Why are they happening? One of the reasons why is because they've talked about increasing taxes. Those taxes are going to hurt the little guy, while the government leaders are flying around on private jets. Okay? Now, I understand why. I know some of those government leaders personally, but it's an issue. And I think that's that kind of disparity. It's the fact that people go, I can't even, I've got to save up to buy shoes for my kid because, my kids, needs new shoes for school. I've got to save up for 3 months to buy them. And I'm seeing governments spend all this money on stuff that I don't agree with. And I'm seeing the top elites flying on private jets and driving around in these super expensive cars. As Michael said earlier, Arkansas. What was it you said? It's got rich soil and poor people, or something along those lines. That's a very poignant point. Australia is like this. Australia is a mineral-rich country, but the majority of Australians aren't actually benefiting from those resources or the profits that are generated from those resources. It all goes overseas, and it all goes to big, massive shareholders and big, massive companies. There is something wrong with this. I'm not going to go to the side of socialism and some of the stuff that is expressed by the left, but I will say that there's a problem, and I think we need to talk about that and get that fixed. Sorry, Rick, over to you.
All right, any of these problems are left and right, but go ahead, Rick.
Right, I'm wondering if there's a new flavor of blue-collar worker, which is the high-tech blue-collar worker. If you're a farmer, you have to be high-tech, because your John Deere thresher is a computer that has to be programmed. And if it breaks and you don't want to pay John Deere $2,500 to fix it, you have to network with people to figure out how to hack and crack into your thresher to fix it. And like if you're a craftsperson selling stuff, via Amazon or Etsy, you have to figure out how to game the system so that that Etsy doesn't take, or Amazon doesn't take 80% of your profits.
It just really quickly, and I want to toss this to Michael, because that is something, and we only got a few more minutes to go, that I have heard people talk about quite a bit, which is this notion of particularly in rural America, that the corporations and the big corporations are taking over, and that the small farmers are being squeezed out. Doesn't matter whether they're black or white or whatever. But I was just wondering, in a farm-related state, and that's part of what brought Clinton into office and everything, was his kind of rural background. But I was just wondering your take on that, because that is something.
Yeah, and he got lobbied, accepted lobby money from Koch brothers and from Tyson. Like, can we see where the problem is with the big corporations? These farmers are indebted. They're treated like indentured servants. Sorry, Michael, I'll let you respond.
Well, the simple answer, they're getting wiped out. I mean, the fact that again, your tractor's a computer. If you're the small, the farmers that were able to, pass the tradition down, their generational land, their generational wealth, all this stuff is going away. And some of this, another area that I'm working in and advocating for, it's really kind of connecting the small farmers and the chefs. It's the whole farm to table movement, the seed to table movement. It's another way so that you can to allow them to become more profitable. But there's no way that subsistence farmers can compete with corporate farms.
There are only 4 big slaughterhouse chains in America, which means they set the prices for cattle. So if you're a small cattle rancher, you can't, your profit margin has been shrunk to nothing. And all you're hoping to do is stay in business long enough to eventually sell your land to a developer.
Well,
you won't even get that. Look at what Tyson does to the chicken farmers, where they force them to buy stuff and then they lend them the money. And the only way they can pay it back. And then they have that competition, the tournament system for chicken prices. But I'd like to ask you a question, Rick, because you talked about blue-collar workers. Let me just ask you a question. I'm sure that Cliff and Michael will have the experience to back up what I'm saying here. I hope that they will back up what I'm saying. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that it would be a good idea for somebody to want to go into investment banking? And before you answer that, it's a rhetorical question, but let me just make this point. So after I gave up the directorship that I had for Halifax in Australia, I decided at the ripe old age of 28 that I was going to go and set up a hedge fund, and I was going to set up a hedge fund trading options volatility and sell that strategy to the people in Dubai. And of course, I'm 40 now, so we're talking 12 years ago. And when I sat there and tried to explain to the Arabs what I was trying to do, it didn't work out quite the way that I had envisaged in my mind. So I had a couple of pretty rough years there, and then my ex became my ex, and all sorts of things happened in my life. And during that time, I was offered jobs for some of the world's largest and most prestigious financial institutions, and I kept turning them down. And at one point, I was actually offered $800,000 US a year to take this job as a base. Now, when you're in this field, your base is your base, and you get multiples of that as bonuses. I turned it down. Why did I turn it down? Because my strategies belong to them, so I turned it down. But here's what happens if you're a college kid. You've just come out of college. What they're going to do is they're going to interview you over a period of 6 to 12 months. Then they're going to give you a contract, so you're not even an employee. You're going to earn nothing. You're going to live in New York City. You're going to have to pay all those rents, and you're at 50, 60 grand a year, but you're worth one of the most prestigious banks. The reality is that most of the employees of these banks are no better off, and in some cases are worse off than if they were a mere mechanic.
Gotcha.
Would you prefer to take a job with those big banks, or would you prefer to go and be an electrician?
Whatever you're doing, but mostly with banking, if you've got an analytical trick that nobody else has, then you've got a temporary advantage. The big time for moving into banking was the 1980s, when just fat old bros, the white drinky guys, were being replaced by people who were grad students in quantum mechanics who had these mathematical tools that disrupted the market. But now the market's saturated.
I employ people like that. I employ people like that. My uncle is one of the deputy principals of the School of Maths and Statistics at one of the leading universities in Australia. I call him almost daily going, hey, I want you to do this for me. I want you to do this data analytics for me. It's wrong because we're wasting our talents just in the pursuit of money. I agree. Michael, clear, actually, everybody, if you can please stay around after the show, I'd like to talk to you guys off air.
And just really quickly, because we are wrapping up and everything, and I do think that predatory lending is very big, and we didn't even get to the way that certain agencies don't just do predatory lending, but I also know that it's still a big deal with the phone cards as well, because we were talking about the international community, and I do know that that is another hustle that goes on in the predatory community, and y'all probably even touch on it in the book and everything. But if you could, as we're heading out the door and ready to start the next show and everything, if you can tell folks how folks can get a copy of the book and when the book will be released and when we can look for a copy. Hopefully we'll have it here on the Amazon store that is connected with Pod TV as well. But definitely if you'll let folks know about your book and where we can get a copy of it.
Yeah. The official publication date of Community Capital is July 30th. So it's next month. And that happens to coincide with National Whistleblowers Appreciation Day. It's the reason for the launch. You can get advanced copies on Amazon now, and it'll be available everywhere books are sold on July 30th.
Sounds good. Definitely looking forward to it.
Don't forget to watch us on Thursday. We have the debate coming up. We'll be doing a pregame and then a postgame and a couple specials that will be running on Pod TV. Thank you for watching, everyone, and have a great day.
Same to you.
Thank you.